When it comes to scary road trip stories and travel horror stories, this is the scariest for me. It was a late summer evening when my buddy Mike and I decided to take a road trip. We were both eager for a break from the daily grind and thought a drive through the countryside would be just the thing to unwind. As we cruised down the empty road, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, creating a picturesque scene. Suddenly, as we rounded a bend, we saw her, a figure dressed in black, standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, her long dark hair blowing in the wind. She raised her hand, signaling for us to stop. Mike slowed down the car, and we both looked at each other, unsure of what to do. It was strange to see someone out here, in the middle of nowhere, especially at this time of day. But before we could make a decision, the woman stepped out onto the road, right in front of us. Mike slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. There was a sickening thud as the car collided with her, sending her flying onto the hood before crashing onto the road. We both sat there in shock, unable to move. Mike finally managed to regain his composure and pulled the car to the side of the road. We got out, trembling, and rushed to the woman's side. To our relief, she was still breathing, albeit barely. We knew we had to get her help, and fast. The nearest hospital was miles away, but we had no choice. We carefully lifted her into the car and set off towards the hospital. As we drove, the woman's condition seemed to worsen. She was fading fast, and we were desperate to get her the help she needed. But then, something inexplicable happened. In the blink of an eye, she vanished. One moment, she was there, lying in the back seat, and the next, she was gone, as if she had never been there at all. Mike and I were stunned, unsure of what to make of it. We eventually reached the hospital and reported the incident to the authorities. They searched the area but found no sign of the woman. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. To this day, Mike and I still talk about that night, trying to make sense of what happened. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of our imagination? Or did we really encounter something otherworldly that night on the lonely road? One thing's for sure. I'll never forget the feeling of fear and confusion that gripped me that night, and I doubt I ever will. During the sweltering days of summer, my father decided it was time to visit our uncle who lived out in the countryside. He said there were some important matters to discuss, so we packed up and hit the road. The drive was long, and the sun beat down mercilessly, making the air feel thick and heavy. When we finally arrived, my uncle welcomed us with open arms. He lived in a quaint little farmhouse surrounded by fields of wheat and corn, stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a peaceful place, the kind that makes you forget about the hustle and bustle of city life. After a hearty meal, my father and uncle settled down to talk, leaving me to explore the area. I wandered around, taking in the sights and sounds of the countryside. As the sun began to set, I decided to head back to the farmhouse. On my way back, something caught my eye. A huge gray rabbit darted across the dirt road, its movements jerky and unnatural. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd never seen a rabbit like that before. Curiosity got the best of me, and I approached the spot where the rabbit had disappeared into the fields. What I saw sent shivers down my spine. The rabbit was there, munching on grass as if nothing was wrong, but its behavior was far from normal. It moved in a strange, almost mechanical way, as if it were being controlled by something else. Its eyes were cold and lifeless, devoid of any emotion. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that crept over me and continued on my way. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of the rabbit from my mind. It haunted my dreams, its strange movements etched into my memory. I woke up in a cold sweat, the feeling of dread still lingering in the air. The next day, I told my father and uncle about the rabbit, but they dismissed it as my imagination running wild. Determined to prove them wrong, I set out to find the rabbit again. I searched high and low, but there was no sign of it. Just as I was about to give up, I heard a rustling in the bushes. I cautiously approached, my heart racing. And there it was, the rabbit, staring back at me with those cold, lifeless eyes. I tried to catch it, to prove once and for all that it was real, but it was too fast. It darted away into the fields, disappearing from sight. I returned to the farmhouse defeated, my mind reeling with thoughts of what I had seen. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a strange noise outside my window. I peered out, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The rabbit was there, staring up at me with those same cold, lifeless eyes. I screamed for my father and uncle, but when they came running, the rabbit was gone. They blamed it on my imagination, but I knew what I had seen was real. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the rabbit was trying to tell me something sinister. I don't know what it was, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never look at a rabbit the same way again. And that's the story of the strange rabbit encounter that still haunts me to this day. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now for more. My father was a tough man, the kind you'd expect to find in a small village. He was big, strong, and known for his hunting skills. He could take down a wolf with his bare hands, or so the stories went. One day, he decided to go on a hunting trip into the wilderness, driving out in his old truck. A week later, we found him lying in his bed, broken and battered. He had wounds and fractures all over his body. When I asked him what happened, he told me a story that chilled me to the bone. He said he was driving down a remote road when he saw a basin by the side of the road. The heat had caused the basin to crack, but that wasn't what caught his attention. It was the sound coming from inside the basin, a deep, sharp sound that seemed to call out to him. At first, he thought he was imagining things. He looked around, but there was no one there, just some chickens nearby. He tried to ignore it, but the sound came again, louder and more insistent this time. It was like a voice, deep and menacing, coming from the bottom of the basin. My father was terrified, but he couldn't resist the urge to look inside. And when he did, he saw something that made his blood run cold. I won't repeat what he saw, it's too horrible to put into words. But whatever it was, it caused him to fall back in shock, hitting his head on a rock. He managed to crawl back to his truck and drive home, but the injuries he sustained were too severe. He died a few days later, never able to fully explain what he saw in that basin. To this day, I can't pass by that spot on the road without feeling a shiver down my spine. My father's story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that there are things out there that defy explanation, things that are better left undisturbed. So this happened a few years back when I was in college. A bunch of friends and I loved the outdoors, so one summer we decided to go camping for a few days, just to get away from the city and enjoy nature. We packed our stuff, loaded up the car, and drove out to this remote spot we had heard about, a few hours away from town. When we arrived, it was already getting dark, so we quickly set up our tents, started a fire, and enjoyed the night. Everything was fine, until we noticed this weird smell lingering around the campsite. It was kind of gross, like rotten eggs or something. We thought maybe it was just some dead animal nearby, so we tried to ignore it and went to bed. The next morning, we woke up to find that the smell was even worse. It seemed to have seeped into everything. We looked around the campsite but couldn't find anything that could be causing it. We decided to go for a hike, hoping that when we got back, the smell would be gone. When we returned, the smell was still there, but this time, there was something else. Some of our stuff had been moved around. At first, we thought maybe one of us was messing around, trying to scare the others. But then we realized that some of our food was missing. We started to get really freaked out, thinking that maybe someone else was out there with us, someone who didn't want to be found. We called the police, and when they arrived, they searched the area. That's when they found it. Hidden in the bushes, not too far from our campsite, was a body. It was a man, and he looked like he had been there for a while. The police said it was probably someone who had been camping out there and had died from natural causes, but it still freaked us out. We packed up our stuff and left that same day, never wanting to go back to that place again. It was a crazy experience, one that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. So yeah, that's my scary camping story. The trip took 3 full days in beautiful weather. The year was 1995 in December, when I decided to travel to Greece. I had been planning this trip for months, eager to explore the ancient ruins and soak in the rich history of the country. The first 2 days of the trip were amazing. I visited the Acropolis, explored the streets of Athens, and indulged in delicious Greek cuisine. But what happened on the last day of my trip still haunts me to this day. It was a chilly night, and I decided to spend it in a cozy cabin in the mountains. The cabin was secluded, surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed gently in the wind. I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat down to relax after a long day of sightseeing. As I sat there, I started singing a song that I loved, letting the melody fill the cabin. But as I reached the end of the song, something chilling happened. I heard a voice that wasn't mine, repeat the last word of the song. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, but there was no one there, just me, alone in the cabin. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that there was a logical explanation for what I heard. But then, the lights in the cabin flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine as I sat there in the blackness, my mind racing with fear. And then, I heard it again, the voice, right behind me, whispering the last word of the song. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. I sat there for what felt like hours, until the first light of dawn crept through the window. I finally mustered the courage to get up and leave the cabin, but the memory of that night still haunts me. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night in the cabin. Was it a trick of the mind or something more sinister? I may never know, but one thing is for sure. I will never forget the terror I felt in that cabin in the mountains of Greece. I'm going to share a true story that happened to some friends of mine. It was winter, and 7 of them decided to go on a road trip, escaping the city for a while. They packed their gear and set off for a remote area far from civilization. When they arrived, they found a perfect spot to set up camp. They pitched their tent, unpacked their supplies, and settled in for the night. Everything seemed normal at first, just friends enjoying each other's company in the wilderness. As the night crept in, they decided to prepare dinner. They gathered around the campfire, laughing and chatting as they cooked their meal. Once dinner was ready, they sat down to eat, sharing stories and jokes. After dinner, one of the older members of the group, let's call him John, suggested they gather some firewood. He pointed to a nearby hill and asked one of the others to go fetch some wood. Let's call him Mark. Mark grabbed a flashlight and headed towards the hill. It was dark, and the trees cast eerie shadows. As he reached the top of the hill, he heard a strange sound, like someone moaning in pain. He called out, thinking it might be one of his friends playing a prank. No one answered. Concerned, Mark continued searching for firewood. Suddenly, he stepped on something slippery and lost his footing. He tumbled down a small embankment and landed hard on his arm, feeling a sharp pain shoot through it. He tried to get up, but the pain was too much. He realized he had broken his arm. Panicked, he called out for help, but no one could hear him over the crackling of the fire and the wind rustling through the trees. He was alone, injured, and scared. Hours passed, and Mark's friends grew worried when he didn't return. They called out for him, but there was no response. They searched the area, shining their flashlights into the darkness, but there was no sign of him. Finally, one of them suggested calling for help. They managed to get a signal and called emergency services. An ambulance and a helicopter were dispatched to their location. It took hours for the rescue team to find Mark, but when they did, they quickly airlifted him to the nearest hospital. He had a broken arm and was suffering from hypothermia, but he was alive. It was a terrifying experience for everyone involved, a stark reminder of how quickly things can go wrong in the wilderness. They never expected their camping trip to turn into a life-or-death situation, but it did. My family owned a cabin in Hancock, New York, nestled in the Catskills. It was a modest place, more like a trailer bolted into the ground, but it held many memories. We mainly used it for hunting, but it was also our escape to nature, hiking, riding quads, and gathering around campfires. One summer, when I was 10 years old, we headed to the cabin for a weekend getaway. My cousin and I shared a large bed in the main part of the trailer, while my dad slept on the couch nearby. Being so close, we always felt safe and secure. One night, I woke up with an urgent need to use the bathroom. As I stumbled out of bed and made my way through the dark trailer, a chill ran down my spine. I felt like I was being watched. Brushing it off as my imagination, I hurried to the bathroom and quickly returned to bed. But as I lay there, trying to fall back asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around the room, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. And that's when I saw him. A man standing at the end of the bed, his eyes fixed on me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to wake up my cousin and dad, but fear rendered me speechless. The man didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to speak. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised a finger to his lips, signaling for me to be quiet. Terrified, I pulled the covers over my head, hoping it was all just a bad dream, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep. The image of the man burned into my mind. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my cousin and dad chatting in the kitchen. I hesitated to tell them about the man, fearing they would dismiss it as a nightmare. But when I finally mustered the courage to speak up, they went silent. My dad exchanged a knowing glance with my cousin before turning to me. "We need to talk," he said, his voice grave. As it turned out, I wasn't the only one who had seen the man. My cousin had seen him too, standing at the foot of our bed watching us sleep. And my dad had heard strange noises coming from outside the trailer, like someone or something walking around. We packed up our things that morning and left the cabin, never to return. But even now, more than 20 years later, I still remember that night vividly, and I firmly believe that there was something inhuman lurking in that cabin. Something that wanted to make its presence known. So if you ever find yourself in Hancock, New York, and come across a small cabin in the Catskills, steer clear. Because whatever haunted that place all those years ago may still be there, waiting for its next victim. I went on a road trip with my 2 friends to Chicago for our cousin's graduation. We wanted to make the most of our trip, so we planned to explore new places and have an amazing time together. As we drove towards the city, we realized it was getting late and we needed a place to spend the night. We all agreed that camping would be a great idea. We wanted to experience the outdoors and sleep under the stars, so we started looking for a good spot to set up our tent. After a bit of searching, we found the perfect camping area. It was nestled in a beautiful park, surrounded by tall trees and a clear blue sky above. We were thrilled to have discovered such a picturesque spot. We quickly got to work setting up our tent. It was a big one with enough room for all of us to comfortably sleep inside. We were all pretty tired from the day's activities, especially from our hiking adventure. We had spent hours exploring the trails and enjoying the scenic views. It was a lot of fun, but also quite exhausting. As we were getting ready to relax and make ourselves comfortable, something unexpected happened. We noticed a young woman approaching us, and she was unbelievably attractive. She looked a bit confused, as if she didn't know where she was going. She politely asked if she could join us and rest for a while. We were all ecstatic. It felt like a magical moment to have someone so stunning want to spend time with us. Excitedly, my friends and I discussed what to do. We came up with an idea. Since we had limited sleeping space, we thought it would be fair for my friend Alex to share the tent with her while the rest of us slept in the car. We figured it would be a great chance for Alex to get to know her better and maybe even create a special connection. As the rest of us settled into the car, we couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and anticipation for what the night had in store for our friend Alex. In the middle of the night, while my friends and I were in the car, we heard strange moaning sounds coming from the tent. It seemed like someone was having a good time in there. We tried to ignore it, assuming our friend and the woman were enjoying each other's company. We were happy for him after all. But a few hours later, our friend Alex, who had been in the tent, came knocking on the car door, crying uncontrollably. We quickly opened the door and asked him what was wrong. Through his tears, he told us that the young, beautiful girl had transformed into a muscular creature with a human-like shape. She had assaulted him, and he was bleeding between his legs. It was a horrifying revelation, and I could hardly believe what I was hearing. One of my friends started laughing, but I quickly hushed him, realizing the seriousness of the situation. We decided not to bother packing up the tent, as blood was splattered all over it. It was a chilling reminder of what had happened. We hastily left the camping spot, speeding away from the park. As we were exiting, we glanced back and saw a creature standing in the distance. It was in the shape of a human, but its appearance was twisted and unsettling. The creature just watched us as we drove off, leaving us with a feeling of unease and terror. It was a road trip that turned into a horrifying nightmare. We never expected such a terrifying encounter during what was supposed to be a fun adventure. The memory of that night still haunts us, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. And for my friend Alex, after coming back from the trip, he never talked to us or hung out with us anymore because he thought we were making fun of him that night.